Last week, we did a short video on Private Hom, a 20-year-old enlisted man from Boston who was reported missing in action on February 2nd, 1944, near the town of Cisterna de Latina, Italy, where his unit was engaged in intense fighting with the Germans. The Defense Department POW MIA accounting agency, or the DPAA, announced that after 80 years, they had positively identified Private Hom's remains and that he'd be returning home to the United States from Italy for his final resting place. To say that the news was a joyous one would be an understatement. Within an hour of reading the government's press release on Private Hom, we created a short video paying tribute to his service and welcoming home. If you want to watch the short video, a link is in the description box below. The video received over 20,000 views in the first 24 hours, and with it many comments thanking Private Hom for his service and welcoming him back home. It was such an interesting and heartwarming story, the government using mitochondrial DNA to positively identify the remains of a soldier some 80 years later, that it naturally spurred questions in the comments section. Viewers were curious to know more about Private Hom's story, and frankly, so were we. Well, fortunately, one of the viewers of the video was Ken Hom, the nephew of Private Hom. Ken left us a comment thanking the viewers for their prayers and regards, and so naturally we reached out to Ken, asking if he would be comfortable telling us a little bit more about his uncle. Ken and I began texting, and then we had a phone conversation. Turns out Private Hom's story is even more interesting than we could have imagined. I appreciate Ken's willingness to discuss it with me and his willingness to allow us to retell it. It's an important story, and we're humbled he would trust us with it. It goes back to the late 1930s when Private Hom's family immigrated to the United States from China. Their village had been particularly hit hard by the ongoing civil war between the nationalists and the communists, and much of their property had been confiscated or destroyed by the communists. They viewed America as a chance for a new beginning and were relieved and appreciative to come to the United States. Wing was barely a teenager when they moved to Boston, and he took quickly to his new country. Back then, new immigrants were quick to Americanize to fit into the culture, and Wing was no exception. When war broke out, Wing felt duty-bound and even obligated to serve his new country. He was also horrified to see the suffering of China at the hands of Imperial Japan, and as soon as he turned 18, he enlisted in the army. The family didn't know much about his time in Italy, and even less about the circumstances surrounding his death, partly because they didn't speak much English, and partly because the army wasn't overly communicative. But when Wing went missing in February of 1944, the family was mostly left in the dark. As Ken told me during our conversation, his grandparents, Wing's parents, never knew when he died, where he died, or even if he was dead. No body was recovered, and little was known. He wasn't actually declared dead until the following February of 1945. And that was that. Ken said that growing up, Wing was rarely discussed. All he knew about his uncle was that he was a good kid and that he loved America. Like many families suffering from loss during World War II, it was just too painful to revisit for the family. And the lack of closure made it doubly more painful. It just wasn't something that they spoke about, as Ken told me. When old movies like The Longest Day or The Dirty Dozen would come on, Ken would invariably ask about his uncle, only to be reminded that he was a good kid and that he loved America. Unbeknownst to Ken and his family, in 2020, a DPAA historian determined that a set of unidentified remains recovered near Cisterna could possibly be Private Hom. The remains, by this time just some fragmented bones, which had been buried at the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery, were disinterred in September 2021 and sent to the DPAA laboratory for identification. At this point, the government reached out to Ken to ask for a DNA sample in order to make a mitochondrial match. It was the first time Ken and the family learned that the United States government was still attempting to positively identify Wing. They were both astonished at the ongoing investigation and cautiously optimistic that the DNA sample would lead to a positive identification. Perhaps their beloved Wing would be coming home after all these years. Then in April, the phone rang. Ken answered it. It was the United States government. They had found his uncle, and he would be returning home. Ken and his family were given the option to have Private Hom laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, but they chose to return him to his loving parents, who are buried in Brooklyn, New York. It's there where he'll spend eternal peace, forever in their gaze and warm embrace. Rest in peace, Private Hom, and welcome home.